Sierra Leone's voters are choosing a new president from among 16 candidates in a race that has sparked debate over dual nationality and eligibility for the country's highest office. The frontrunners in Wednesday's vote are Samura Kamara, the incumbent's pick, a successor, and Julius Maada Bio, the man who was defeated in the 2012 election. The race most likely will head to a second round later in March, as observers say it's unlikely any one candidate will receive 55% of the vote. African affairs analyst Adeniyi Kunnu joins us now on the News Hour for his perspective on this issue. Good to have you here on the News Hour.
Thank you very much.
So let's begin with your thoughts on the outcome generally of the Sierra Leone elections. What do you think about it?
It would interest you to know that Sierra Leone is as much a troubled country as many African countries, since it first experienced a civil war in 1967, the same year Nigeria had the citizens of the country battered for 3 years. But let's look at what happened between 1991 and the year 2000 when the civil war lasted. You're talking about a civil war that started with the Army Corporal called for the Sanko, who criticized the governments then. And of course, the coup that eventually turned out to be what the country struggled with for the 10 years it did was actually led by a certain Valentine Stresser. Well, in that particular civil war, leading up to the millennium, certain other things happened that the British government had to actually intervene, so much that 800 paratroopers were sent into the country. Now, let's move between that time and now and examine the unhealthy situation. I'd like to talk about Maada. It was a man defeated in 2012, a retired army officer. Now, the question you want to first of all ask is, what is he looking for? The typifications of African rulership, and I've used my word carefully and deliberately, is that we don't seem to realize the trends of time. Sierra Leone, the southwestern part of Sierra Leone actually leads to the Atlantic Ocean. That's why they say the country is situated on the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
Now, the natural disaster that affected the country some years ago, less than three years ago, actually has left the country with a whole lot of problems that have not been resolved. Now, you'll be looking forward to the kind of leadership, now I've chosen my word carefully again, that would first of all come with a grasp of the problems. And that's why I say that the likes of Maada should just understand that they should allow people who could do it. But let's also examine the successor of NS by Koroma, who appears favored. Now, under the All People's Congress, the same APC in Sierra Leone, the party in power, we've had endemic corruption. Now, that particular country is such that people could sign paperwork without even knowing who signed it, and they get it out as genuine. That's one of the endemic corruption. Now, the wounds of the civil war, let me tell you for the records, have not completely healed, because the grievances still pervades the land. So you're talking about the country that obviously practices democracy, but the institutions of governance are battered by so many problems that they really must come to terms
with. So you don't think you have any faith, sorry, Buki, you don't have any faith in the elections
whatsoever? Well, I wouldn't say I won't have faith. If you look at it, there are about 17,455 ballot boxes around the 5 regions where the elections held. As I speak, all the paperwork are back. Of the 17,000, about 37 ballot boxes were judged not fit to return because they were tampered with. That's about 0.2% of the entire ballot boxes. Fantastic. The observers themselves, particularly the National Watch on Election, the National Election Watch, have said about 10,000 people were actually deployed in the different 5 areas. So you have about 50,000 election observers. The international community as well has not come out to tell us that, well, infractions are so much. But don't forget that in the course of this election, the opposition party office, Sierra Leonean People's Party, was also raided. So the question you want to ask me is this: why will you raid the office of the opposition party, if not for 2 reasons, allegedly? One, to either make them get unsettled and not concentrate on the election, or perhaps to just show that you are the one in power and just try to gag them and not make them really do what they have to do. Because once your offices are ransacked, that is more or less like where people have their reprieve. You gather, more or less as it's a psychological, haven for them to come and think. But now you've gone to unsettle them. The election that they should have observed to make sure that things don't happen negatively, they find it difficult to do.
I'm glad you pointed out at the start of your commentary that it's one of the poorest nations and so many natural disasters have dogged that country since its emergence from civil war. Which brings me to another issue shaping this election, the issue of dual nationality and eligibility. In this 21st century, where Sierra Leone is faced with all of these challenges, should that form part of the narrative, where the country is looking ahead to development?
Well, I think the law is the law. If the country's constitution stipulates that for you to participate in any election, you should not hold dual nationality, then I think the first thing is to obey the ground norm of the country. The same thing is obtainable here. And permit me allude to the current Senate President, Bukola Saraki, who had the same challenge at the point he emerged as a Senate President, that he had both Nigerian and British nationalities. Of course, they were able to quell the other, but we're waiting for the post-election years for us to have people do investigative journalism and find out if indeed the truth was what they told us. So going back to Sierra Leone, the Constitution doesn't permit you to have dual nationality and want to be a reign. And if the Constitution has so said, I think it is ideal, not belaboring ourselves with all of the inanities and needlessness about should it be looked at. Yes, indeed it should be looked at, because I have to say this. If you look at some economies of the world, they are essentially controlled by the Bretton Woods institution. And when you school in places like the United Kingdom or the United States of America, and you have their influence, which takes me to Sudan, the current president of Sudan has American citizenship, has American education, was backed by the American institution, and eventually emerged as the president of Sudan, having been backed by the American institution. Of course, money, even if they don't throw it out in the open, logistics, even if they don't throw it out in the open, all of these things were made provision for to ensure that the man emerged. Why? First, they believe that our education affords you the opportunity to think about 21st century leadership style. Secondly, our interests should be protected. And let's not forget that the West also supplies ammunition to the greater part of the countries where there are conflicts today. I stand not to be corrected here.
To say that Sierra Leone has weightier problems than such primordial
No,
sentiments.
it is not primordial.
Look at Obama.
Look at where I took it.
Obama had dual nationality.
No, not at all. Look at where I took it to. I'm telling you that the influence the American or the Western institutions will have on African leadership will be much more than the influence the same institution will have on the likes of Obama. They are two worlds apart. The institutions in America, that is over 200 years since independence, are much stronger, much independent, very difficult to influence. And that is why you have people. Trump has actually set a Guinness World Book of Records account. He has actually accounted for the greatest number of people who resigned their appointments from his administration. That is not common in this part of the world. You can imagine the Nigerian situation. There are people who fail on their responsibilities and they just don't go away. There's somebody who has said that my allegiance is to another party, my allegiance is to another person who has not even become president, and the person is still a minister in this country. So I'm saying that the American case cannot be taken into account here, because most of these countries are also subsisting on the grants given to them by people or by the West.
So in other words, they cannot live by themselves.
They really can't live by them. If you look at it as we speak.
But the evolution of America's democracy also took time. It was a process.
I am saying that the process, let's say this, and I'd like us to understand, if we check the records, if we look at history, the dynamisms that gave birth to African countries completely differ. The Americans will tell you, if they really don't want to tell you the truth, that they are not colonized. But indeed, to a great extent, they were colonized. But if you look at virtually all the countries on the African continent, South America and North America, they were products of repression and inhumanity.
Okay, so what can be done to change the narrative in that Sierra Leone?
What can be done is, if you look at it with the way it's going, the National Electoral Commission of Sierra Leone have come out to tell the world that it appears as if there's going to be a runoff. That simply means if you don't get 55% of the vote, you really have to go again, just as we have in neighboring Liberia. I think strongly that with the two leading candidates, they will likely, maybe if there's a third, we would know maybe by tomorrow. If at all there's a third, the three could go for the runoff.
All right.
And it looks likely that either of the first and second, but of course the power of incumbency cannot be pushed aside.
Thank you very much, Adeniyi Kunnu.
Thank you for your time as well. Thank you for having me.